this video, I'm going to talk about the creative and technical aspects of using shutter speed to make your films look more cinematic and polished. I'm going to use FiLMiC Pro to show you how you can achieve great-looking video with your smartphone and a low-cost camera app. Shutter speed is a very important setting when shooting video or film. Different settings create different looks, as well as presenting different challenges, mainly with exposure. The shutter speed, in combination with frame rate, can also be used to overcome strobing when filming with artificial light. What is shutter speed? Put simply, shutter speed is the length of time the shutter of your camera is open for each frame exposed. Therefore, shutter speed controls the amount of light reaching your camera's sensor. FiLMiC Pro, like other camera systems, measures shutter speed in fractions of seconds. So a setting of 148 means your shutter will be open for 1/48th of a second. And if you set your camera's frame rate to 24 frames per second, then your shutter will be open for 1/48th of a second 24 times per second. Simple maths then informs you your shutter will be open for half the time and closed half the time. Most of the manual settings available to use on our digital camera originated when cameras were very much mechanical devices. In the very early days of photography, a camera's shutter was actually the lens cap. The photographer would remove the lens cap, allowing light through the lens, then replace the cap after the required exposure time had elapsed. To give you an idea of how far we have come, the oldest surviving photograph is now thought to have had an exposure time of several days. This photograph was taken in the year 1826 or 1827. That's approaching 200 years ago. In these early years, the light-sensitive material used for image capture reacted so slowly that the shutter speed had to be extremely slow too. Indeed, so slow that moving objects were impossible to capture. Now, this photograph is the oldest existing photo containing people. The exposure time was so long, none of the traffic or pedestrians remained in the frame long enough to leave a mark, except for two men, one having his shoes polished by the other. The very first true shutters were actually separate accessories. Meanwhile, inbuilt shutters only became common by the end of the 19th century. In 1888, George Eastman developed his first camera and called it Kodak. The device was a very simple box camera with a fixed focus lens and single shutter speed. Much like the smartphone cameras today, this Kodak camera was designed to be simple to use. Thus, the camera appealed to the masses, and George Eastman went on to make his fortune. These days, even consumer cameras offer shutter speeds of 1/16,000th of a second. This is only possible due to the modern development of highly sensitive light sensors, which need far less light to capture an image. Therefore, much higher shutter speeds are possible. Motion picture cameras used in traditional film cinematography employ a mechanical rotating shutter. The shutter rotation is synchronized with film being pulled through the gate. Hence, the shutter speed in a movie camera is derived via frame rate and shutter angle. With a traditional shutter angle of 180 degrees, film is exposed for 1/48th of a second at 24 frames per second. And this is why this frame rate plus shutter speed combo is often recommended for video shooters trying to emulate the film look. Rather than a mechanical shutter opening and closing, smartphone cameras have electronic shutters. Essentially, FiLMiC Pro will tell the camera sensor to expose a frame for a set amount of time. The sensor then records the light information in a line of pixels, and it does so from the top of the sensor to the bottom. And even though there's no actual physical shutter involved, this setting is still known as shutter speed. How do we set shutter speed in FiLMiC Pro? Open FiLMiC Pro. Open Manual Controls. Now move the exposure wheel to set the desired shutter speed. Click on the shutter speed to lock it and it goes red. Note the left wheel controls both shutter speed and ISO at the same time. However, by locking either ISO or shutter speed, the wheel can then be used to control the non-locked setting alone. As shutter speed has more effect on the look than ISO, I usually lock shutter speed first and then use the wheel to control the ISO. How does shutter speed change the look of video? The faster you set the shutter speed, the darker the image. Also, the faster you set the shutter speed, the less motion blur you get. But the slower you set the shutter speed, the lighter the image. Also, the slower you set the shutter speed, the more motion blur you get. But what is motion blur? Again, put simply, your camera's shutter speed controls the amount of motion blur appearing in each frame, and more or less, motion blur changes the way your video looks. While a few online explainers claim motion blur is more realistic, this is not exactly correct, so let me explain why. First thing to remember is that the human eye does not see the world as a series of still frames. However, humans discovered that by flashing a series of still images at a certain speed onto a screen, the illusion of movement could be created. Before digital video, the practical task of capturing a series of still images fast enough to maintain this illusion, about 24 frames per second, involved a complex mechanical device that we now know as a cinema camera. Without going into the entire history of camera technology, suffice it to say many compromises were involved before 24 frames per second became standard for movies. For example, Thomas Edison insisted 46 frames per second would be the perfect frame rate and easiest on the human eye, but shooting at 46 frames per second was simply too much to ask for movie cameras and film stock at the time. Therefore, after a series of experiments with other frame rates, they had to settle on 24 frames per second. This turned out to be the best compromise between what looked smooth to the eye, as well as not costing too much. But if Edison had had his way, the film look would now involve a faster shutter speed and much less motion blur. What this all means is, while motion blur does not exist in reality, and digital cameras no longer restrict us to 24 frames per second and 1/48th of a second shutter speed, the desire to create motion blur remains, albeit as a purely artistic choice. So what are the artistic uses of motion blur? Increasing motion blur helps to create smoother looking video that feels more like how we see the world. Alternatively, as you reduce motion blur, those still images flashing before our eyes 24 times per second become more distinct. Remember, moving images are an illusion created by a series of still images presented one after the other, so that our minds are tricked into seeing movement. And what motion blur does is further assist that illusion by smoothing and blurring the jump between each frame. Just to confuse everyone, filmmakers decided one 180-degree rule simply wasn't enough, and so invented two. Therefore, while one 180-degree rule refers to camera angles, the other refers to shutter speed and frame rate. While stills cameras use what's known as a focal plane shutter, movie cameras use a rotary shutter. Now, when this rotary shutter is set to 180 degrees, the frame is exposed for half the time. Therefore, a 24 frames per second frame rate in a movie camera with the rotating shutter set to 180 degrees would expose each frame for 1/48th of a second. Okay, so the 180-degree shutter rule is pretty simple and could be applied to all frame rates, couldn't it? For example, when shooting at 240 frames per second, you would need a 480th of a second shutter speed to mimic the film look, right? Well, let's think about this. The 180-degree rule isn't so important at higher frame rates, and this is down to the difference between film and digital video. While short explanations on achieving the film look are easier to digest, a deeper understanding will lead to better looking videos. So let me go over why I think the 180-degree rule is best used as a general guide when using FiLMiC Pro. Why do we need the 180-degree rule anyway? The reason filmmakers talk about the 180-degree rule is down to the desire to make their videos come out looking more like film. And most of this is to do with motion blur created when setting your shutter at around a 48th or a 50th of a second. But once you start to increase your shutter speed above a 50th of a second, you start to move away from the level of motion blur we are familiar with from 24 frames per second film. So, to be more specific, motion blur assists the illusion of moving images when shooting at around 24 frames per second, but at higher frame rates, less motion blur is required, or even possible. Certainly shooting with a shutter speed of 1/480th of a second will produce pretty much no visible motion blur. Generally speaking, digital cameras can more easily shoot at higher frame rates than film. Whereas digital cameras only need to switch a sensor on and off, film cameras are restricted by the practical need to expose physical film. Few, if any, shooting film would use 60 frames per second to capture and then play back at 60 frames per second, because the only reason to shoot at a higher frame rate, and therefore faster shutter speed, with film would be to produce slow motion. Film was, and still is, expensive, and shooting 60 frames per second would use up much more film than at 24 frames per second, over twice as much. For example, when Shane Carruth shot his debut micro-budget movie Primer, he was so desperate to save film, he used an extremely low shooting ratio of 2:1. In other words, half the footage he shot ended up in the final film. Now, take the popular Arriflex 535 movie camera, a favorite of Oscar-winning cinematographer Roger Deakins. The Arriflex 535 only shoots at a maximum of 60 frames per second, a speed cinematographers would use only for special shots, for example, slow motion. If we are filming in bright conditions and our ISO setting is at its lowest, we sometimes find ourselves unable to slow shutter speed to the 1/48th or 1/50th setting. This usually happens when filming in daylight outside. The answer to this problem is to use a neutral density filter, otherwise known as ND filters. ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera. They block some of the light hitting the sensor, thereby allowing you to set a slower shutter speed. ND filters come in different strengths. Alternatively, there are adjustable ND filters, which are a all-in-one solution. What happens when you use fast shutter speeds? Of course, if you are filming at a high frame rate, you will need a faster shutter speed. But what happens when you film at 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, but with a shutter faster than the 180-degree rule dictates? As motion blur is reduced, the individual frames become more obvious to the eye. Therefore, movement begins to look staccato. In other words, as edges of moving objects become more defined, they appear harsher and less pleasing. While most of the time filmmakers seek to avoid this, there are notable exceptions. The most famous being the fast shutter speed used for filming some shots in the film Saving Private Ryan. Director Steven Spielberg and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski decided to try to make their action scenes look a bit different to standard Hollywood war scenes by using a faster shutter speed. As they were shooting with film, this meant adjusting the rotary shutter from 180 degrees to 90 degrees or 45 degrees. Therefore, shooting at 24 frames per second, a 90-degree shutter would create a 1/96th shutter speed. And Janusz Kaminski stated they did this to make the World War II battle scenes more realistic.
We are achieving certain crispiness of explosions. Everything becomes slightly more realistic.
Wait, what? Hang on, isn't the 180-degree rule supposed to make our shots look more realistic? Yet a legendary film director and his cinematographer chose to shoot using 90 degrees and 45-degree shutters to create a look that is more, realistic. Both can't be true, right? So what is going on? What this shows you is that filmmaking is not as simple as learning a rule and sticking to it. Luckily, filmmaking is still about making creative choices. Yes, a 180-degree shutter at 24 frames per second might be more appropriate for a, say, romantic scene or when creating polished shots. But when we want to depict terrified soldiers fighting their way across the living hell of Omaha Beach in 1944, then faster shutter speeds help convey the reality those soldiers were going through. You see, shutter speed creates a more or less realistic look depending on the feeling you want to convey to your audience. And if you want to create something less comfortable on the eye but which carries greater gritty realism, then you might choose a faster shutter. While a mechanical shutter works using moving parts, a digital shutter is basically nothing more than your sensor being switched on and off for a set amount of time. However, digital shutters are usually set using the same standardized shutter speeds, and FiLMiC Pro uses similar numbers. Now, the shutter speeds available in FiLMiC Pro depend on the frame rate you set, perhaps to help us achieve the 180-degree rule. For example, with my frame rate here set to 25 frames per second, shutter speeds available start at 1/25 and go up in doubles each time. But if I set the frame rate to 24 frames per second, the shutter speeds available now are 1/24th, 1/48th, 1/96th, 192nd, and so on, all the way up to 1/3072th of a second. While FiLMiC Pro seems to follow the 180-degree rule, other camera apps and digital cameras do it differently. For example, some DSLRs can shoot at 24 frames per second but have no 1/48th of a second shutter speed available. Meanwhile, free Android app Open Camera allows me to set shutter speeds from 1/5 of a second up to 1/10,000th of a second in increments that appear to be unique to the app. And the Open Camera app clone, HedgeCam 2, dispenses with whole numbers altogether, allowing shutter speed to be adjusted to a decimal point of a fraction of a second. So this illustrates one difference between digital and mechanical shutters. While a mechanical shutter needs to work around the engineering of metal and plastic, digital sensors can be switched on and off for whatever length you desire, and we can assume the only reason FiLMiC Pro restricts us to certain shutter speeds is down to ease of use and the familiarity of standardized shutter speeds. And what this all leads us to conclude is that the 180-degree shutter rule doesn't need to be adhered to too strictly. All we need to understand is that at slower frame rates, motion blur is normally desirable, but shutter speed doesn't need to be exact. For example, 24 frames per second and 1/50th of a second shutter speed would be perfectly acceptable for the film look. Because the difference between 1/48th and 1/50th is only 2/100ths of a second, and no human will ever see the difference. So what else do we need to consider when setting shutter speed? When you are shooting video with FiLMiC Pro, you might notice artificial light start to strobe. This looks like waves or pulses of light from bright to dark. This is because artificial lights flicker, and they do so at a rate depending on where in the world you are shooting video. For example, in the USA, electricity supply of 60 Hz means lights flicker 60 times a second, but a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or multiples of 1/60th of a second should solve the problem. In Europe, electricity supply comes at 50 Hz, and therefore 1/50th or multiples of 1/50th of a second should also solve the problem. Well, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.